The winter of 1950 had teeth sharper than any blade, and it bit deep into the bones of everyone foolish enough to call the streets of Brooklyn home. In the shadow of the Manhattan Bridge, where the city's forgotten came to disappear, a small figure lay curled against the cold brick of Torino's bakery. Marco D'Angelo was 9 years old and had been dead to the world for 3 days running. Not literally dead, though he'd wished for it more than once as the February wind cut through his threadbare coat, like it was made of paper. Dead in the way that mattered, invisible, forgotten. Another piece of human wreckage that the city would sweep away when the snow melted. His stomach had stopped growling 2 days ago, which Marco had learned was a bad sign. Now it just ached, a hollow burning that made his vision blur at the edges. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery had been torture at first, but now even that couldn't penetrate the fog of hunger that wrapped around his brain like cotton. "Mama," he whispered to the empty alley, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "I tried to be good. I tried to find work like you said." But his mama couldn't hear him anymore. She'd been gone for 6 months, taken by the fever that swept through their tenement building like divine judgment. The other families had scattered to relatives in New Jersey or Pennsylvania. But Marco had nowhere to go. No family, no friends, no one who would notice if he simply stopped existing. The orphanage had been worse than the streets. Brother Francis with his leather strap and his lectures about sin. The older boys who took his food and his shoes and left him with nothing but bruises and shame. Marco had escaped after 2 weeks, choosing the honest cruelty of winter over the disguised brutality of charity. That had been in December. Now it was February, and Marco was learning that freedom and death could look remarkably similar. The sound of footsteps made him press deeper into the shadows. In his experience, footsteps usually meant trouble, but these were different somehow, measured, purposeful. The kind of footsteps that belonged to a man who never hurried because he never had to. Don Giuseppe Torino appeared at the mouth of the alley like a figure from a dream. He was a compact man in his 50s, with silver threading through his black hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His overcoat was wool, expensive, the kind that kept out both wind and bullets. Behind him walked 2 larger men who moved like shadows given weight and substance. Marco tried to make himself smaller, invisible, but it was too late. The Don had seen him. "Jesus and Mary," the Don said softly, his voice carrying the faint accent of Sicily even after 30 years in America. "How long have you been here, boy?" Marco's throat felt like sandpaper when he tried to speak. Only a whisper came out. 3 days, sir." The Don approached slowly, the way you might approach a wounded animal. His men stayed back, hands resting casually inside their coats, watching the alley entrances with professional alertness. 3 days, without food. Marco nodded, not trusting his voice again. The Don knelt beside him, apparently unconcerned about his expensive suit touching the dirty ground. Up close, Marco could see the lines round the man's eyes, the small scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, the way his hands remained perfectly still even in the cold. "What's your name?" "Marco D'Angelo." "And where is your family?" "Marco D'Angelo, gone." The word came out hollow, empty of everything but truth. "All gone." The Don studied him for a long moment, and Marco found himself caught in that gaze. He'd heard stories about Don Torino, whispered in the neighborhood barbershops and corner markets. The man who controlled the docks. The man who decided which businesses thrived and which ones burned. The man who could order death with a gesture and pardon with a smile. But the eyes looking at him now weren't the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of someone who understood loss. Salvatore. The Don called without looking away from Marco. "Go inside. Tell them to wrap up a loaf of bread. The good bread. And some of that soup Mrs. Antonelli made." One of the shadows detached itself and disappeared into the bakery. "When did you last eat?" Marco tried to remember. Time had become fluid, meaningless. "Sunday, I think. Maybe Saturday." The Don's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And before that, the orphanage. But I left because..." Marco's voice trailed off. How could he explain the fear, the hopelessness, the way Brother Francis looked at the younger boys? "Because they were not kind to you. It wasn't a question. Marco nodded anyway. Salvatore returned with a paper bag that smelled like heaven and a thermos that steamed in the cold air. The Don took them and dismissed his men with a subtle gesture. They moved away but didn't leave, taking up positions that gave them clear sight lines of the alley. "Here," the Don said, opening the bag and pulling out a chunk of bread still warm from the oven. "Eat slowly. Your stomach has forgotten how to handle food." Marco took the bread with shaking hands and bit into it carefully. The taste exploded across his tongue, rich and yeasty and perfect. He wanted to devour it, to stuff the entire loaf into his mouth at once, but something in the Don's voice made him listen. "Good. Now some soup." The soup was thick with vegetables and meat, the kind of meal Marco remembered from before his mother got sick. As he ate, the Don sat back on his heels and watched, occasionally murmuring encouragements or warnings to go slowly. "Tell me about your mother," the Don said when Marco had finished half the bread and most of the soup. "She cleaned houses, worked hard, always made sure I had something to eat, even when she didn't." Marco's voice grew stronger as the food warmed him from the inside. "She used to sing while she cooked, old songs from Italy that her mama taught her. And your father," Marco's expression darkened. "Never knew him. Mama said he was a sailor who promised her everything and gave her nothing but me." The Don nodded as if this was a familiar story. "The world is full of men who make promises they cannot keep. But you have been taking care of yourself for 3 days in February. That takes strength." "I don't feel strong." Strength isn't always about feeling strong. Sometimes it's about surviving when everything tells you to give up. The Don stood, brushing off his knees, finished the food, all of it, and then we're going to have a conversation about your future. While Marco ate, the Don made a phone call in rapid Italian, his voice too low to overhear. When he finished, he turned back to the boy. "Marco, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you know who I am?" Marco nodded. "You're Don Torino. People say you run things around here. People say many things, some true, some not. But yes, I have influence in this neighborhood. I take care of certain problems. I protect certain people. And sometimes I help boys who have nowhere else to turn." The Don paused, studying Marco's face. "I'm offering you a choice. You can go back to the orphanage, and I'll make sure they treat you better. Or you can come with me. I'll give you food, shelter, education, a family of sorts. But understand this. If you choose to come with me, you become part of my world. There will be expectations, responsibilities, and someday, when you're older, there will be choices that good people shouldn't have to make." Marco set down the empty thermos, his mind racing. He thought about Brother Francis and his leather strap. He thought about the cold alley and the hunger that had nearly killed him. He thought about his mother's voice singing old Italian songs. "If I come with you," he said slowly, "will I have to hurt people?" The Don's expression grew grave. "Not now, not for many years, and when the time comes, if it comes, you'll be old enough to make your own choices. But I won't lie to you, Marco. The world I live in is not always gentle." Marco looked around the alley that had nearly become his grave, then back at the man who had appeared like an angel, with bread and soup. "I don't want to go back to the orphanage." "Then you won't." The Don extended his hand, and Marco took it. The man's grip was firm, warm, steady. As they walked out of the alley together, Marco felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. "Welcome to the family, Marco D'Angelo," the Don said quietly. "From this day forward, you are under my protection. No one will let you starve again." Behind them, the alley settled back into shadow and silence. But for Marco, everything had changed. The boy who had been forgotten by the world had been claimed by a man who never forgot anything. It was the beginning of a new life, though neither of them could have predicted just how dangerous that life would become. 7 years had transformed Marco D'Angelo from a starving waif into a lean, watchful young man of 16. The Don's house on President Street had become his world, a fortress of stone and tradition where every conversation was a lesson, and every meal was earned. The morning found Marco in the Don's study, carefully transcribing ledgers under the patient supervision of Father Benedetti. the family priest who served as both spiritual advisor and accountant. The numbers told stories that would never see the inside of a courthouse, tales of protection fees and tribute payments, of businesses that thrived under the family's umbrella, and those that withered without it. Attention to detail, Marco, Father Benedetti murmured, his weathered fingers pointing to a discrepancy in the column. In our business, small mistakes become large graves. Marco nodded, making the correction with practiced precision. The Don had insisted on education, both formal and otherwise. Marco could recite Latin conjugations and calculate compound interest with equal facility. He could also strip a pistol in the dark and read the subtle language of fear in a man's eyes. The study door opened and Salvatore Torino entered. At 25, the Don's son carried himself with the casual arrogance of inherited power. His expensive suit tailored to hide the gun at his shoulder. Where his father was patient steel, Salvatore was barely controlled fire. The Napolitano situation needs handling, Salvatore announced, settling into a leather chair without invitation. They're 3 weeks behind on their payments, and word is getting out. Father Benedetti glanced up from the ledgers, his expression disapproving. Perhaps we should discuss this elsewhere. Marco's practically family, Salvatore said dismissively. Besides, it's time he learned how real business gets done. Marco kept his eyes on his work, but every word burned itself into his memory. The Napolitanos ran a small grocery store 6 blocks away, the kind of place where old women argued over the price of tomatoes, and children pressed their faces against the penny candy jars. Marco had bought bread there with his first legitimate dollar, a milestone the Don had insisted they celebrate. What are you suggesting? Father Benedetti asked carefully. Salvador's smile was cold as January wind. A conversation. Maybe some broken windows to help them remember their obligations. Violence should be the last resort, not the first. Tell that to the families who'll think we're going soft if we let this slide. The debate continued, but Marco's attention was caught by the sound of the Don's footsteps in the hallway. After 7 years, he could identify that measured gait from 3 rooms away. Salvatore heard it too and straightened in his chair, his casual arrogance replaced by something approaching respect. Don Torino entered like weather changing, his presence shifting the entire atmosphere of the room. At 57, he moved, with the careful grace of a man who had survived 3 decades in a business where most men died young. His dark suit was perfectly pressed, his silver hair combed straight back, his eyes missing nothing. Good morning, Father, Marco. He nodded to each in turn before fixing his son with a stare that could have frozen wine. Salvatore, I hear you have opinions about the Napolitano matter. They're making us look weak, Papa. Every day they don't pay is another day. The other shopkeepers wonder if they need to pay either. The Don moved to his desk, settling into his chair with deliberate slowness. And your solution? Make an example. Something visible enough that everyone gets the message. I see. The Don steepled his fingers, a gesture Marco had learned usually preceded either wisdom or violence. Marco, what do you know about the Napolitanos? The question caught Marco off guard, but he'd learned never to hesitate when the Don asked for information. Tony Napolitano, age 43, married to Rosa, 3 children. The oldest boy, Michael, is 12. The family's been in the neighborhood for 15 years. Never missed a payment until last month. And why did they start missing payments? Marco hesitated. This was information he'd gathered on his own, not part of any official assignment. Mrs. Napolitano has been seeing Dr. Castellano twice a week. Michael mentioned to some friends that his mother's been real sick. The Don's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Cancer, I think so. Sir, Salvatore made an impatient gesture. So what? Everyone's got problems. That doesn't mean they get to skip their obligations. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Father Benedetti stopped breathing when the Don finally spoke. His voice was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. Marco, how much does the Napolitano family owe us? $1,800, sir. And how much do you estimate Mrs. Napolitano's medical bills will cost over the next year? Marco did quick calculations in his head. At least 10,000. Probably more if she needs surgery. The Don nodded slowly. Salvatore, I want you to visit Mr. Napolitano today. Tell him his debt is forgiven. Furthermore, Dr. Castellano will receive payment for Mrs. Napolitano's treatment directly from our family accounts. Salvador's face flushed red. Papa, that's not how. That's exactly how we do business. The Don's voice cut across his son's protest like a blade. We are not common criminals who prey on the desperate. We are guardians of this neighborhood. When one of our people suffers, we all suffer. When one of our people needs help, we all help. The other families will think that Don Torino takes care of his responsibilities, that he values loyalty over fear, that he builds power through respect, not terror. The Don stood, his decision final and absolute. Marco, you will accompany Salvatore today. Consider it part of your education, if you're enjoying Marco's journey from orphan to family. Please subscribe to help support our storytelling efforts and production costs. That afternoon, Marco walked beside Salvatore through the familiar streets of their neighborhood. The older man's anger simmered just below the surface, manifesting in sharp gestures and muttered complaints about his father's soft approach to business. You don't understand, Salvatore said as they approached the grocery store. Papa's getting old, sentimental. In our world, sentiment gets you killed. Marco listened without comment, but privately he disagreed. In 7 years of observation, he'd never seen the Don make a decision based purely on emotion. Every gesture of mercy served a larger purpose. Every act of kindness was also an investment in loyalty. The bell above Napolitano's door chimed as they entered. The store was exactly as Marco remembered, small and crowded, smelling of garlic and old wood. Tony Napolitano emerged from behind the counter, his face going pale when he recognized his visitors. Mr. Torino, he said carefully, his hands trembling as he wiped them on his apron. I was going to come see your father this week. I have some money, not all of it, but relax. Tony, Salvatore interrupted, his tone businesslike but not unkind. I'm here with good news. Marco watched as Salvatore delivered the Don's message, noting how the older man's face transformed from fear to disbelief to overwhelming gratitude. By the time they left the store, tears were running down Tony Napolitano's weathered cheeks. You see, Salvatore said as they walked back toward President Street. Now he'll tell everyone how generous the Torino family is, how we take care of our own. Papa gets his loyalty, and it only cost us a few $1,000s. It wasn't about the money, Marco said quietly. What? The Don didn't forgive the debt to buy loyalty. He did it because it was the right thing to do. The loyalty is just a side effect. Salvatore stopped walking and turned to face him. You think you understand my father better than I do. The challenge in his voice was clear, dangerous. Marco had seen what happened to people who crossed Salvatore Torino, but he'd also spent 7 years learning from the wisest man in Brooklyn. I think, Marco said carefully, that your father understands power better than anyone I've ever met. And real power doesn't come from making people fear you. It comes from making them want to protect you. That evening, Marco found the Don in his garden, tending to the tomato plants he grew in large pots arranged around the small courtyard behind the house. It was one of the old man's few indulgences, this connection to the soil of his homeland. You handled yourself well today, the Don said without looking up from his plants. Salvatore wasn't happy with your decision. Salvatore sees trees. I see forests. The Don straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. He's my son, and I love him. But he lacks patience. He wants to rule through fear because fear is quick and easy to understand, and you rule through respect. I try to rule through necessity. When people need you, truly need you, they don't betray you. They become part of you. The Don moved to another plant, checking the small green tomatoes beginning to form. Fear fades. Marco, gratitude endures. Is that why you saved me? Because you knew I'd be grateful. The Don was quiet for so long that Marco wondered if he'd overstepped some invisible boundary. Finally, the older man set down his gardening tools and looked directly at him. I saved you because you reminded me of myself at your age, alone, hungry. forgotten by everyone except the criminals who saw you as either a victim or a tool. The Don's voice grew soft, almost vulnerable. But you were also brave. Brave enough to survive. Brave enough to trust. And brave enough to ask difficult questions. What happens when I'm older? When the time comes to make those choices you warned me about? The Don smiled, and for a moment he looked like nothing more than a tired father concerned about his son's future. When that time comes, Marco, you'll be ready. Because I'm going to make sure you understand not just how to use power, but when not to use it. That's the difference between a gangster and a leader. As they walked back into the house together, Marco felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. He was no longer the starving boy from the alley. He was becoming something else. Something shaped by the Don's wisdom and patience. He was becoming the future. The autumn of 1960 painted Brooklyn in shades of rust and gold, and Marco D'Angelo stood at the crossroads between his past and his future. At 25, he had grown into the kind of man who commanded attention without demanding it, whose silence carried more weight than other men's threats. The Don's lessons had taken root deep in his bones. The meeting was set for midnight at the old Gowanus warehouse, neutral territory where the 5 families could gather without fear of ambush or surveillance. Marco adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror of the black Cadillac, checking the small recording device hidden in his jacket pocket one final time. Tonight would determine whether he lived to see another dawn. You remember everything we discussed? Don Torino asked from the passenger seat. At 67, the old man had developed a slight tremor in his left hand, the only outward sign of the cancer that was slowly consuming him from within. The doctors gave him 6 months. Marco suspected he'd last longer through sheer force of will. Every word, Marco replied, starting the engine. But I still think there's another way. There's always another way, my boy. The question is whether we can live with the consequences. The past 3 months had been a careful dance on the edge of a knife. Salvatore Torino, impatient for power and convinced his father's methods were outdated, had made a deal with the Colombo family. The plan was simple in its brutality. Frame the Don for the murder of a federal judge, then step in to take control of the family's operations while the old man rotted in prison. What Salvatore hadn't counted on was Marco's loyalty, or the network of informants the Don had cultivated over 30 years of careful relationship building. The recording device in Marco's pocket contained enough evidence to destroy Salvatore and half the Colombo hierarchy, but using it would shatter the family and likely start a war that would consume everything the Don had built. He's your son, Marco said as they drove through the empty streets toward the warehouse. And you're my chosen heir. Blood doesn't always make family, Marco. Sometimes it just makes traitors more painful to deal with. The warehouse was exactly as intimidating as it was meant to be. For stories of brick and shadow, surrounded by empty lots where weeds pushed through cracked concrete like accusations, security was heavy but discreet. Professional men who recognized faces and moved like dancers around the edges of violence. Inside, the 5 families had arranged themselves around a massive oak table, like feudal lords dividing a kingdom. Don Torino took his seat with the dignity of a man who had never backed down from anything, while Marco stood behind him, hands clasped, eyes cataloging every face in the room. Vincent Colombo sat directly across from them, a man in his 50s, whose expensive suits couldn't quite hide the dock worker's brutality in his shoulders. To his right, Salvatore Torino looked uncomfortable but determined, avoiding his father's eyes while playing with his gold wedding ring. Gentlemen, Don Torino began, his voice carrying easily through the cavernous space. I understand there are concerns about my leadership, about my methods, about my fitness to continue representing our interests in this changing world. Nothing personal, Giuseppe, Colombo said, lighting a cigar with theatrical casualness. But times are different now. The feds are getting smarter, more aggressive. We need leaders who understand that survival sometimes requires flexibility in our principles. Flexibility. The Don repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. An interesting choice of words. Vincent, tell me, what exactly do you think I've been inflexible about? The judge situation. For starters, Judge Morrison has been a problem for all of us, but you refuse to authorize the obvious solution. Marco felt his jaw tighten. Judge Morrison was a federal district court judge who had been systematically dismantling organized crime operations throughout the city. He was also a devoted father of 3 and a man who genuinely believed in justice. The Don had forbidden any action against him, arguing that killing federal judges would bring down heat that none of them could survive. So you've decided to solve that problem yourselves, the Don said quietly. Frame me for the murder, remove me from power, and then claim my territories as compensation for the inconvenience. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the guards seemed to stop breathing. Columbo's expression didn't change, but his cigar paused halfway to his lips. That's a serious accusation, Giuseppe. It's also accurate. The Don gestured to Marco, who stepped forward and placed the recording device on the table. Salvatore was very thorough in his planning, very detailed. In his conversations with your people, Salvador's face went white as bone. Papa, I can explain. No. The word cut through the air like a blade. There's no explanation for betraying your family. There's no excuse for selling your father's life to buy your own advancement. The Don stood slowly, his presence filling the warehouse like gathering storm clouds. Gentlemen, you have a choice to make. You can honor the agreements our families have maintained for 30 years, or you can try to take by force what you cannot earn through respect. But understand this. If you choose force, if you move against me or mine, I will burn this entire structure to the ground before I let you profit from my death. You're outnumbered, old man, Columbo said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Your own son is with us. Half your soldiers are ready to switch sides, are they? The Don smiled, and Marco recognized the expression. It was the look of a chess master revealing a trap 20 moves in the making. Marco, would you share our guest list for tonight's festivities? Marco stepped forward again, this time producing a manila folder filled with photographs and documents. Gentlemen, meet the federal task force that's been investigating your operations for the past 18 months. Agent Thompson, Agent Rodriguez, Agent Chen, and their supervisor, Assistant Director Walsh. He spread the photographs across the table like dealing cards, clear, professional surveillance photos of every person in the room except the Don and Marco himself. You see, the Don continued conversationally, while you were planning my downfall, I was planning your education. Every phone call, every meeting, every conspiracy to commit murder has been carefully documented and delivered to the appropriate authorities. Columbo shot to his feet, his hand moving toward his jacket, but found himself facing 6 guns held by men who had emerged from the shadows around the warehouse. The Don's real security, professionals who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Sit down. Vincent, let's finish our conversation like civilized men. You're bluffing, Salvatore said, but his voice shook with uncertainty. You'd never cooperate with the feds. It goes against everything you've taught us. What I've taught you, the Don said, his voice heavy with disappointment, is that loyalty flows both ways. That power comes from service, not from taking. That a man who betrays his family will betray anyone. The Don walked around the table, stopping behind his son's chair. You want to know why I chose Marco over you, Salvatore? It's not because I love him more. It's because he understands what you never could. This life, this power. It's not about what we can take from the world. It's about what we can protect. The feds will never let you walk away from this, Columbo said desperately. They will if I give them something better than my arrest, the Don replied. Something like a complete organizational chart of your operations, detailed financial records, and testimony about 3 decades of criminal activity. The trap was perfect, inevitable, beautiful in its simplicity. The Don had spent months setting it up, using Salvador's betrayal as the bait to draw his enemies into the open. Now they had 2 choices: accept his terms or face federal prosecution. That would destroy them all. What do you want? Columbo asked finally. I want to retire. The Don said simply, I want to spend my remaining months tending my garden and teaching my chosen successor how to lead with wisdom instead of fear. In exchange, you get to keep your freedom and learn what it means to earn respect instead of demanding it. The negotiations took 3 hours. When they were finished, the criminal landscape of Brooklyn had been permanently altered. Vincent Colombo would plead guilty to tax evasion and serve 18 months in minimum security prison. His organization would be absorbed into the other families under strict oversight. Salvatore would be exiled to Sicily, never to return to American soil, and Marco D'Angelo would inherit control of the Torino family's operations, with the understanding that those operations would be transitioning toward legitimate business. Over the next 5 years, as they drove home through the empty pre-dawn streets, the Don seemed smaller somehow, as if the confrontation had drained something essential from him. "Do you think I was too harsh with Salvatore?" he asked quietly. Marco considered the question carefully. "I think you were a father who loved his son enough to save his life, even when that son didn't deserve it. And as a leader, you chose the future over the past. You chose building something lasting over protecting something broken." The Don nodded, satisfied. "The recording device was never connected to the feds, you know. That was all." "Theater," Marco smiled. "I know, but Colombo didn't. And if he had called our bluff, then we would have improvised. That's what you taught me. Always have a plan, but be ready to adapt when the plan fails." They rode in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the city wake up around them. Finally, the Don spoke again. "There's something else you need to know. Something I've never told anyone." Marco waited, sensing the weight of whatever revelation was coming. "That night I found you in the alley. It wasn't an accident. I'd been watching you for weeks, ever since your mother died. I knew about the orphanage, about your escape, about how you'd been surviving. Why? Because I saw something in you that I'd never seen in my own son. Honor, real honor, not the performance of honor. You could have become a criminal, could have started stealing or running numbers or selling yourself like so many orphans do. Instead, you chose to starve rather than compromise your principles." The Don paused, his trembling hand gripping the door handle as they pulled up to the house on President Street. "I didn't save you, Marco. You saved yourself. I just gave you the tools to do it properly." As they walked into the house together, Marco felt the full weight of his inheritance settling on his shoulders. Not just the businesses and territories and responsibilities, but the deeper legacy of wisdom and restraint that the Don had spent 30 years building. He was no longer the orphan boy who had been left to starve in an alley. He was no longer even the grateful son who had been given bread and shelter. He was Don Marco D'Angelo now, leader of one of Brooklyn's most powerful families, guardian of a tradition that valued honor over profit and loyalty over fear. The transformation was complete, and somehow, he suspected his real education was just beginning. Thank you for following Marco's incredible journey from abandoned orphan to respected leader. If these stories moved you, and you'd like to help us continue creating compelling narratives like this, please subscribe to support our production costs. Your support makes these powerful tales possible.